There is a moment in every ancient text where a symbol ceases to be merely a line of ink on parchment and takes on a kind of life of its own. In the last book of the Christian Bible, Revelation, that moment comes like a slow thunder. It begins with a vision of a world in collapse, empires trembling, seas turning dark, powers rising that do not look human anymore, but overshadowing everything, hovering with a kind of quiet inevitability, is the symbol that would echo louder than almost any other image in religious history, the mark of the beast. Revelation does not arrive gently. It is a book written in exile, born from a mind under both divine pressure and political threat. Its images are feverish but deliberate, wild but precise. Early Christians did not read it as fantasy. They felt it as commentary, as code, as a message whispered from someone who understood how power works. They lived in a world where survival often meant compromise, and where loyalty to the empire was demanded, not softly but with teeth. And John's vision reflected that pressure back at them like a mirror made of fire. The mark, when first introduced, is presented not as a mystical tattoo or glowing sigil, but as an enforced sign of allegiance, something placed on the right hand or the forehead, something people must accept in order to buy bread, water, shelter, something that ties the economy to the empire, the market to the throne, the soul to the ruler. The power of this idea was not in its shape, but in its function, a sign you could not refuse without losing the ability to survive. Early listeners would have felt this immediately. They recognized the shape of this threat long before theologians debated it. Rome already demanded signs of loyalty, sacrifices, inscriptions, oaths, and those who refused were punished, sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically. The mark was not a future nightmare. It was a present one. But Revelation pushes the concept further. It is not simply a political stamp, nor a bureaucratic requirement. It is a symbol of ownership. In the worldview of the text, human beings belong either to the Lamb or to the beast, and the mark is the dividing line. A line drawn not on parchment, but on flesh. The forehead, in biblical literature, is the place of identity, of thought, of selfhood. The right hand is the place of action, of work, of participation in society. To mark these places is to claim both the mind and the labor of a person. It is to say, "You are mine." And yet, this is where the power of the symbol multiplies, because Revelation does not reveal the mark fully. It gives only details, the number 666, the location of the mark, the consequences of refusing it, but never the look of it, never the process of receiving it, never the exact meaning of the number beyond a cryptic, "It is the number of a man." And in that ambiguity lies endless room for interpretation, distortion, and reinvention. This is why the mark of the beast has survived not just as a relic of ancient religious imagination, but as a living idea, one that has resurfaced in every era of fear. It is a symbol that shapeshifts with technology, politics, and cultural anxiety. In ancient times, it was a mark of loyalty to Caesar. In the Middle Ages, it was a sign of heresy. In the Reformation, it was the stamp of one's theological enemies. In the modern age, it has become everything from barcodes to microchips, from biometric IDs to digital currencies, from vaccine passports to AI-managed systems of control. The symbol never changes, but everything we attach to it does. As the idea traveled across centuries, something curious happened. It drifted from its original context in Roman imperial worship, and instead began to orbit around the fear that human freedom could be stolen quietly, not through violence but through convenience. A mark that makes life easier, access to markets, participation in society, becomes a mark that takes something in exchange. For ancient Christians, this was loyalty to the empire. For modern audiences, it becomes something even more personal: autonomy. And this is why the mark still has such gravity. It does not rely on belief in prophecy. It speaks to something older and deeper, a fear that systems of power can override the individual, that technology can slip into identity, that survival can be weaponized. The mark is a symbol about thresholds. It asks, how much will you give up to remain part of the world? At what point does convenience become control? When does participation become surrender? The answers change across cultures, across eras, across technologies, but the fear remains the same. The mark is never just about the beast. It is about the world that demands something from you, something you may not be willing to give. This is where our story begins, with a symbol that refuses to die, a number that refuses to be forgotten, and a question that refuses to be answered. This is the shadow of Revelation, the first movement in a story that spans empires, centuries, fears, and futures. And from this shadow, the mark rises. There is a temptation, when reading Revelation, to imagine it floating outside of history, a thunderous prophecy disconnected from the world that produced it. But the mark of the beast does not rise in a vacuum. It rises in a time when allegiance was not an abstract matter of belief, but a daily, physical performance demanded by the empire itself. To understand the mark, we must understand Rome. In the first century, Rome was not merely a political structure. It was an entire ecosystem of power. It controlled borders, markets, roads, trade, identity, and even time. Under its rule, life was ordered by decrees that reached into every corner of existence. How food was taxed, how coins were minted, how temples functioned, how loyalty was demonstrated. And inside that vast machinery sat the emperor, a figure who, by the late first century, had become not only a ruler, but a divinely sanctioned symbol of authority. The imperial cult, the worship of the emperor, was a practical system disguised as a religious obligation. It was not about faith the way modern readers understand faith. It was about belonging. Public loyalty ensured political stability. Political stability ensured the empire's survival. The emperor was the center of that stability. To honor him was to honor Rome. To refuse him was to expose yourself as an enemy of the public order. This was the world early Christians inhabited. And for many of them, refusal wasn't theoretical. Cities required public acts of devotion to the emperor temples, held ceremonies that acknowledged his divine status. Markets often expected participation in civic rituals tied to his name. And in some provinces, refusing such acts could limit your ability to participate in trade, to purchase goods, to work. This is the heartbeat behind the mark of the beast. The mark, in its original context, is not a futuristic microchip nor an invisible tattoo. It is a symbolic representation of the imperial system that demanded submission, stamped into everyday life. Revelation does not invent the idea of a mark on the hand or forehead. It repurposes imagery from Roman practices and ancient covenantal symbols. Jewish tradition placed God's law between the eyes and upon the hand as a metaphor for identity and action. Rome, in its own way, demanded that its laws be written onto the life of every subject. So, when Revelation speaks of a mark required for buying and selling, its listeners didn't imagine lasers or circuitry. They thought of Rome's expectation that allegiance be visible, demonstrable, and inescapable. This is where the fear in Revelation becomes more than symbolism. It becomes personal. Imagine living in a small Christian community in Asia Minor. You gather quietly at night, perhaps in a home or a workshop after hours, reading letters from men who were arrested or killed for refusing the emperor's demands. You navigate a society where your livelihood could depend on participating in rituals you believe compromise your faith. Every coin you touch bears the emperor's face, often inscribed with divine titles. Every meal bought in the marketplace may have passed through a system that demands spiritual compromise. You feel the weight of being small, exposed, vulnerable in a world that does not share your allegiance. Now imagine hearing Revelation for the first time. The beast rises from the sea, a symbol of empire coming from beyond your borders. It speaks like a dragon, a symbol of divine opposition. The mark is introduced as a requirement for participation in the economy. Those who refuse it must endure hunger, poverty, exclusion. Those who accept it align themselves with the empire's ultimate source of power. This is not fantasy for these listeners. This is a coded retelling of what they already fear. The number 666, the cryptic signature of the beast, mirrors a widespread ancient practice called gematria, where letters equaled numbers. Many scholars believe 666 corresponds to Nero Caesar, spelled in Hebrew numerals. To early Christians, Nero was not simply a cruel ruler, but a symbol of unrestrained imperial violence. His name carried the resonance of fire, persecution, and terror. And though Nero died decades before Revelation was written, the memory of his brutality lingered like a scar the empire refused to heal. In naming the beast through numbers, Revelation constructs a symbol that is both specific and universal. It points to Nero, but also to every ruler who embodies the same violent, controlling spirit. It anchors itself in the past while leaking into the future. This is why the mark is not bound to a century. It is archetypal. It is elastic. Rome made its people perform loyalty. Rome made its people carry signs of allegiance. Rome tied its economy to its emperor. Revelation simply illuminated what was already happening, and the illumination made the structure look monstrous. But here lies the lasting power of the mark. It is not a condemnation of Rome alone. It is a warning about the dangers of any system that demands total allegiance, any power that claims ownership over identity, thought, or participation in society. Rome is the first image of the beast, but every empire, every government, every technological structure that tries to blur the line between necessary order and oppressive control carries its shadow. In this way, the mark remains a living symbol. It is rooted in Rome, but it grows wherever power tightens its fist. It becomes relevant whenever societies debate freedom, conformity, economic access, or the price of belonging. To understand the mark is to stand at the intersection of history and fear, to witness how one empire's demands became the template for every tyranny that followed. And as we move through this documentary, we will watch how this symbol evolves, how it mutates, how it keeps returning whenever people feel that the world is asking for too much. Revelation is not simply a prophecy. It is a language for describing the machinery of power. And in the world of Rome, that machinery was already grinding. The mark of the beast was already visible, not on skin, but in the breathless pressure of empire. Numbers have always held strange power over the human imagination. They are symbols, measures, coded messages, and sometimes obsessions. But among all numbers that have ever traveled through human culture, from the sacred 7 to the perfect 10 to the eternal 0, none has carried the weight, dread, and fascination of 666. It is more than a number. It is a shadow. To understand how deeply it affected the ancient world, picture the way numbers functioned in antiquity. Before mathematics became a universal language, numbers were woven into meaning. They were not merely tools. They were carriers of identity, philosophy, and destiny. Ancient languages often used letters as numbers. Every name, phrase, or title could be transformed into a numerical expression, like a signature carved into reality. This was gematria, a system that allowed numbers to whisper in the margins of texts. When Revelation declares that the number of the beast is the number of a man, and his number is 666, it is inviting the reader into this coded world. It is saying, the identity of this power is hidden in plain sight. if you can do the math. For early Christians, the identity was unmistakable. When the name Nero Caesar, is spelled in Hebrew characters, the letters add up to 666. That alone was enough to electrify the imagination of persecuted communities who saw Nero as the embodiment of imperial violence. Even after his death, rumors of his return, the Nero Redivivus legend, circulated like smoke in the Roman world. Nero became a symbol of tyranny that refused to stay in the grave. But the story of 666 does not end there. In some early manuscripts of Revelation, the number is not 666, it is 616. To modern readers, this might seem like a textual error, but to ancient readers, it meant something very specific. 616 is the numerical value of Nero Caesar, when spelled in Latin, not Hebrew. Two different numberings, two different languages, one symbol. This duality shows that Revelation's author was not just encoding a historical figure. He was constructing a symbolic architecture. 666 was not meant to be solved. Once it was meant to be reinterpreted again and again, taking on new faces as empires rose and fell. The number itself is crafted with precision. In Jewish symbolism, 7 represents divine completion. 6 represents something almost complete, but falling short. To repeat it 3 times is to intensify the concept of falling short, revealing a counterfeit perfection, a parody of the divine, a system that mimics order and authority but lacks the essence of goodness. In other words, 666 is the number of distortion, a reflection of a reflection, a copy that thinks it is real. This symbolic resonance is why the number has survived millennia. It is not tied to a specific technology or moment in time. It is tied to a pattern of power, a structure of control, a way of bending human loyalty. As the centuries unfolded, new meanings attached themselves to the number like iron filings around a magnet. Medieval theologians saw 666 as a sign of corrupted institutions. Reformers, centuries later, used the number to label their religious opponents. Whole movements pointed the number toward rival kings, popes, governments, or economic systems. It became a kind of cultural weapon, a way to declare that a thing or a person carried the stain of oppressive power. But the modern world gave 666 an entirely new life. With the rise of technology, the number expanded beyond ancient politics. It became part of a broader fear. That identity itself could be manipulated, quantified, or captured by systems too large for any individual to resist. From barcodes to biometric IDs, from microchips to digital wallets, every new innovation that touched the body or controlled access to commerce was folded into the number's gravity. Not because of prophecy, but because of symbolism. The mark of the beast was always about linkage, a connection between identity, allegiance, and economic participation. Modern society, with its interconnected databases and centralized forms of access, resurrects that fear instinctively. People recognize something familiar, even if they cannot articulate it. They feel the echo of a system where identity determines survival, where belonging can be revoked, and control can be disguised as convenience. This is why 666 keeps returning, century after century. It is not simply a number. It is a cultural constant, a mythological container where people store their anxieties about power, technology, and the fragility of autonomy. It is the fear that the human self, the mind, the will, the capacity to choose, can be overwritten by forces larger than life. Embedded in this fear is a deeper question. How much of your identity belongs to you? How much of it is shaped by the systems you live within? The mark of the beast and the number that defines it is not a prediction of future doom. It is a mirror held up to every era that must grapple with the same dilemma: the tension between human conscience and the demands of authority. The number 666 reminds us that identity is always at risk. not from demons, not from monsters, but from the quiet encroachment of power on the inner life. It is a symbol that forces us to ask whether we recognize ourselves in the world we are becoming, and in that question lies the true haunting. Before the mark of the beast became a symbol for modern fears, before microchips, before digital IDs, before barcodes, before paranoia could be mapped onto circuitry, it was first and foremost a question of identity and participation. Why the forehead? Why the hand? Why these places on the human body? To the ancient imagination, the body was not a biological device. It was a canvas where meanings were inscribed. And for the listeners of Revelation, the forehead and right hand were not random choices. They were loaded with centuries of symbolic weight. The forehead was the seat of thought, intention, belief, and character. In Hebrew tradition, the forehead represented who you truly were. Priests in the temple wore golden plates on their foreheads, engraved with "Holy to the Lord," indicating their role, identity, and purpose. The forehead was not just a physical space, it was a declaration. The right hand represented actions, labor, participation, and the visible expression of one's allegiance. To mark the right hand was to mark one's work, one's ability to provide, one's place in society. In ancient legal contexts, a person's right hand could be bound in contracts, in oaths, in systems of tribute. It was the symbol of your involvement in the world. When Revelation says the beast places a mark on the forehead or the right hand, it is declaring something far more profound than the arrival of a sinister tattoo. It is describing a system that claims both your mind and your role, a structure that seeks to unify thought and action under a single controlling power. To early Christians, this interpretation was not abstract. They lived in a world where loyalty to Rome was expected in both public attitude and public behavior. Your thought was to honor the emperor's greatness. Your actions were to participate in rituals acknowledging his divine authority. To refuse either was to risk punishment. Thus, the mark is a kind of inverted covenant. Where God seals his people with internal transformation, the beast stamps its followers with external allegiance. One changes the heart, the other alters the social body. But the symbolism goes deeper. In the ancient world, slavery, military service, and temple devotion often came with literal physical markings. Some slaves were branded. Some soldiers bore signs of loyalty etched into their skin. Even worshippers in certain cults received body marks indicating their chosen deity. The mark of the beast draws its imagery from this world, a world where your body could become proof of who owned you. Revelation weaponizes this imagery. It suggests an empire that sees its people not as citizens, but as property. An empire where participation in society is conditional on surrender. Yet this marking is not only physical, it is economic. The mark controls buying and selling. It dictates who can stand in the marketplace, who can trade grain, who can access daily survival. Ancient Christians recognized this logic well. Roman trade often intersected with civic rituals, sacrifices, and oaths that compromised their beliefs. Participation in the empire's economy often meant bending to the empire's demands. This is the engine behind the mark, an enforced link between allegiance and economic access. And in this link lies the chilling genius of the symbol. Because every society, every empire, every system of power eventually discovers that the easiest way to enforce conformity is not through violence, but through the control of participation. People will endure persecution, but they cannot easily endure exclusion from food, water, shelter, or survival. A mark that determines whether you can buy or sell is not just a mark of belief. It is a mark of dependency. It turns the marketplace into an altar. It transforms commerce into worship. It turns the simple act of survival into an expression of allegiance. And here lies the heart of the terror. The mark of the beast forces the human body into a negotiation with power, not through ideology, not through force, but through need. This is why the imagery has survived every political, cultural, and technological shift. It speaks to a universal reality, that systems of authority often shape themselves around the human need to eat, to work, to belong. The mark becomes a metaphor for any structure that binds identity and survival so tightly that freedom becomes impossible without sacrifice. Across centuries, this symbolism expanded. Medieval Christians saw the mark in corrupt political systems. Later generations saw it in oppressive religious institutions. In the 20th and 21st centuries, people saw it in social security numbers, credit cards, RFID tags, biometric scans, and the merging of financial identity with technology. Not because these things are inherently sinister, but because they tap into a primal worry that Revelation exposed long ago, that the line between participation and surrender can become invisible, and that control can be disguised as convenience. The mark of the beast remains potent because it is not just about flesh. It is about systems. It is about how societies organize power, how they define belonging, and how easily those structures can slip into domination when fear, scarcity, or ambition take the reins. The forehead and the hand, thought and action, become the battleground where humans negotiate who they truly belong to, and what they are willing to pay to remain part of a world that never stops asking for more. For many readers today, the book of Revelation is a distant, fantastical text, a storm of imagery flashing across the horizon of ancient imagination. But for the Christians who first heard it read aloud, it was not fantasy. It was not even distant. It was the language of their emotional world, a mirror held up to their anxieties, their losses, their hopes, their confusion, and their fear. To understand the mark of the beast, we must step into that world, a world of small gatherings, whispered prayers, and trembling anticipation, a world where the line between survival and conviction was drawn more tightly than most people today can imagine. Early Christianity was not a religion of cathedrals, institutions, or public ceremonies. It was a network of house churches, artisans, fishermen, widows, slaves, wanderers, and a few wealthy patrons who risked their reputations to offer safe space. They met in courtyards, workshops, upper rooms, and hidden chambers carved out of the edges of cities. They were a movement of the margins, too strange to be accepted, too committed to disappear. When Revelation appeared in this environment, its imagery was not horrifying. It was familiar. These believers already felt the presence of the beast before they had a name for it. They saw it in local magistrates who demanded public conformity. They saw it in guilds that tied economic participation to pagan festivals. They saw it in neighbors who reported them when they refused to sacrifice at civic events. They saw it in coins, sculptures, and inscriptions that glorified emperors as divine. They saw it in trials where silence could condemn and speech could kill. They felt the empire's breath on their necks every time they gathered in secret. The idea of a mark that controlled buying and selling was not a prophetic warning to them. It was a poetic reflection of their daily challenge. They knew what it meant to be excluded. They knew what it meant to fear. They understood instinctively that Revelation was not describing a far future but reinterpreting the present through spiritual language. This is why early Christians embraced apocalyptic imagery so naturally. They did not see apocalyptic writing as a blueprint for future events. They saw it as a lens that revealed the spiritual battle behind their suffering. The beast was Rome. The dragon was the dark power behind Rome. The mark was the pressure to conform. The Lamb was their hope. The New Jerusalem was the world they longed for, but could not yet see. In this context, apocalyptic identity emerged, a way of living that fused patience with resistance, Early Christians saw themselves as people living in a world that was not truly theirs. They felt like strangers in their own cities, like citizens of a kingdom that had not yet arrived. And they found in Revelation a vocabulary for expressing that feeling. This identity shaped their behavior. They lived with a quiet tension, a sense that the world around them was both temporary and dangerous. Every ritual they refused, every festival they avoided, every oath they declined became an act of symbolic resistance, a refusal to accept the mark. They believed their faith made them a counter-empire, a people whose loyalty belonged not to Caesar, but to a different kind of king. In this way, the mark of the beast became more than a warning. It became an identity boundary. You were either marked by the beast, shaped by empire, molded by its demands, absorbed into its system, or you were marked by God, sealed with a different kind of allegiance. This dual identity framed their lives. It offered meaning in suffering, dignity in exclusion, and hope in fear. It gave structure to a world that otherwise seemed uncontrollable. If the empire was a beast, then their resistance was not weakness. It was faithfulness. They were not outcasts. They were chosen. This apocalyptic identity did more than comfort them. It bonded them. It turned scattered groups into communities held together not by social status or shared occupation, but by a shared story. A story of endurance. A story of waiting. A story that told them, this world is not the final one. Stay faithful. Hold your identity tightly. Do not let the world write itself onto your skin. And though centuries have passed, this early Christian posture still shapes interpretations of the mark today. It forged a habit of reading the world suspiciously, of questioning authority, of seeing power structures as potential instruments of domination. It cultivated a belief that the deepest threats are not physical, but spiritual, that the real danger is not death, but allegiance to the wrong master. Modern anxieties about technology, government, economics, and identity trace their roots to this original fear, that something might claim you without your consent, that survival might cost you your soul, that the world systems may not be neutral, but predatory. Before 666 became a cultural phenomenon, before conspiracy theories painted the mark onto every new device, it was simply this, a symbol of what it meant to remain oneself in a world that wanted to reshape you. That fear, ancient, intimate, and deeply human, is where the mark's journey truly begins. By the time the Roman Empire faded into dust and its marble halls crumbled into ruins, the mark of the beast had already drifted far beyond its original context. It had survived persecutions, councils, and the reshaping of the entire Christian world. It had slipped quietly from the fears of small house churches into the libraries and monasteries of medieval Europe, where it would take on an entirely new life. The Middle Ages were a time when the world felt textured with the supernatural. Illness carried moral weight. Storms were divine messages. Kings ruled by heavenly mandate. And history itself was understood as a long, fragile arc, guided by God, toward an ultimate end. In such a world, revelation was not simply scripture. It was the key that unlocked the meaning of time. And the mark of the beast became one of its brightest, darkest beacons. The medieval world was shaped by hierarchy. God above angels, angels above kings, kings above nobles, nobles above commoners, commoners above serfs. Everything had a place, a purpose, a rank. But Revelation introduced something profoundly destabilizing. It suggested that the existing order, no matter how sacred it appeared, could become corrupted. It implied that power itself, when twisted, might carry the mark. This opened a door that theologians, mystics, monks, priests, and even rebellious thinkers would walk through for centuries. In this era, the mark of the beast began to shift from an image of Roman tyranny to a broader warning about institutional corruption. Since the medieval church was the most powerful organization in Europe, interpretations inevitably gravitated toward it, either defending it or accusing it. Some theologians believed the mark represented worldly sin, a stain of disobedience that covered those who loved power or wealth more than God. Others believed it signified allegiance to heretical teachings, especially during theological upheavals. Still others saw it as a literal sign that would appear during the final days, placed upon the wicked as a clear division between the saved and the damned. But there was another dimension, a growing fear that the mark might be expressed through systems, not just symbols. The medieval world was full of systems most Christians didn't fully understand: feudal obligations, taxation networks, papal decrees sent across continents, the slow bureaucratic spread of canon law, the expanding power of kings over their populations. Every new layer of authority felt like a web tightening around the ordinary person's life. This is where the mark began to take on structural meaning. Some thinkers began asking unsettling questions. Could the mark be hidden in legal requirements? Could allegiance to corrupt rulers bring spiritual danger? Could economic or political systems themselves carry the stain of the beast? Could obedience, given blindly, become a form of spiritual compromise? For the first time, the fear surrounding the mark expanded beyond individual behavior and into the architecture of society. Early Christians feared Rome. Medieval Christians feared something subtler, the possibility that the beast could infiltrate the very structures meant to guide and protect them. This shift transformed the mark into a lens through which people interpreted movements, institutions, and power struggles. When plagues swept through Europe, some saw them as signs of the end, and the mark took on a more urgent tone. A sign that the world was hurtling toward judgment. During the Crusades, some preachers warned that unbelievers or opposing kingdoms bore the beast's influence. During the Inquisition, the mark became a way of distinguishing orthodoxy from heresy. But the most dramatic reinvention came from apocalyptic preachers, mystics, ascetics, and visionaries who believed they were living close to the final days. They painted vivid pictures of the mark as a universal sign that would appear when the world reached peak corruption. Some described it as a literal brand, others as a metaphysical stain, others as a social requirement that forced Christians to choose between conformity and martyrdom. The result was that the mark of the beast became deeply embedded in the medieval imagination, not as a single idea, but as a constellation of fears. Fear of corrupt authority, fear of institutional betrayal, fear of false teachers, fear of unseen powers weaving themselves into the fabric of society, fear that the world might demand allegiance in ways that felt harmless until it was too late. What began as a warning about Rome transformed into a psychological and spiritual framework through which medieval Christians evaluated their world, and this framework would set the stage for what came next: the Reformation, the rise of new churches, and an explosion of interpretations that would bring the mark even further into cultural consciousness. By the time the Middle Ages ended, the mark of the beast had become something far more flexible, far more potent, and far more deeply rooted in the Western mind than ever before. It was no longer just a shadowy mark on the hand or forehead. It had become a tool, a way to critique, resist, fear, explain, and interpret every form of power that touched human life. It had become a symbol that could be bent to fit any age. And the world was about to enter an age that would stretch that symbol further than anyone could have imagined. By the time Europe reached the early 1500s, the mark of the beast had already expanded far beyond its ancient roots. It had become a flexible weapon, a symbol that could be used not only to describe oppressive systems, but to condemn one's theological enemies. And when the Reformation erupted, this symbol didn't just reappear, it detonated. To understand why, we must briefly step into the raw atmosphere of the time. The Church dominated almost every part of life. It authorized marriages, sanctified rulers, mediated salvation, collected taxes, and interpreted scripture. Its cathedrals towered over cities. Its priests shaped the rhythms of life from birth to death. It was both a spiritual institution and a political force. Immense, intricate, global. But beneath this structure, a pressure had been building for centuries. Questions about authority, frustrations about corruption, unease about indulgences, relic sales, and the wealth of bishops. Quiet murmurs in monasteries about returning to the simplicity of early Christianity, and an increasing awareness of how profoundly institutions shape belief. When Martin Luther took up his pen, he didn't just criticize practices, he cracked open the structure of power itself. The moment he nailed the 95 Theses, the world shifted. Suddenly, ordinary people questioned the very foundations of religious authority. If the church could be wrong, profoundly wrong, then what else could be distorted? And if corruption could infect the highest offices of the Christian world, then Revelation's warnings no longer described distant empires. They described the present. And with that realization came fear. The mark of the beast surged into the center of public imagination with renewed force, not as a distant future sign, but as a present accusation that could be aimed anywhere. Reformers accuse the Church. Many Protestant reformers came to believe that the beast of Revelation symbolized a corrupt religious institution, and that the mark represented blind obedience to it. They saw the mark in the rituals, traditions, and demands of the Church, especially where they believed those demands contradicted Scripture. In their eyes, the mark was not physical. It was conformity to a system that claimed divine authority, while, in their judgment, betraying it. Preachers proclaimed from pulpits that those who submitted to ecclesiastical power were receiving the mark. Pamphlets circulated depicting religious leaders with horns, crowns, and beast-like features. Artists carved woodcuts showing peasants kneeling before monstrous figures disguised in clerical robes. The Church accused the reformers. But accusations cut both ways. Catholic authorities condemned the reformers as heretics, disturbers of order, destroyers of unity, false teachers leading people into deception. Many theologians argued that rejecting the sacraments, rejecting apostolic authority, rejecting unity for the sake of private interpretation, was itself the act of the beast. To abandon the Church was to embrace chaos, and to embrace chaos was to bear the mark. Thus the same symbol was used by opposing sides to condemn each other. For the first time in Christian history, the mark was not attached to emperors or pagans. It was directed inward, a sign of internal schism, of spiritual warfare within the body of Christianity itself. Printing press, the great amplifier. The printing press poured fuel on the fire. Suddenly ideas traveled faster than armies. Propaganda spread across borders in days. Tracts describing the mark as a sign of papal corruption circulated widely. Counter-arguments appeared within weeks. Woodcut illustrations, dramatic, terrifying, impossible to ignore, portrayed allegorical beasts wearing crowns, mitres, or clerical vestments. These images shaped public imagination in ways no sermon could. Scripture once locked behind Latin liturgy was now in people's homes, in their native languages, and when ordinary people encountered revelation without filter, without mediation, the imagery hit with raw, unsoftened power. The mark became a cipher for everything they distrusted: authority, institutions, hierarchy, foreign influence, economic power, and the tension between human conscience and imposed belief. Society itself became the battleground. The Reformation was not purely theological. It tore apart villages, families, kingdoms, and entire regions. Allegiance wasn't just a personal decision, it was political. To identify with one group could threaten your livelihood, your safety, or your life. And when allegiance becomes a matter of survival, the language of the mark, the link between identity and access, becomes frighteningly relevant. Some communities believed that participating in certain rituals meant bearing the mark. Others believed that refusing those rituals meant bearing it. People were caught in an impossible tension: the fear of corruption on one side, the fear of rejection on the other. In this world of upheaval, the mark of the beast was no longer a symbol of Roman oppression. It had become a framework for understanding crisis, a way to interpret the collapse of social order, the fracturing of institutions, and the rise of competing claims to truth. A new fear emerged. For the first time, people began imagining the mark not simply as a sign of allegiance to a specific ruler, but as a force that could infiltrate any human system. This fear was not aimed only at governments or churches. It extended to money, culture, and even knowledge itself. The result was a century where almost everyone saw the mark everywhere. And in the cultural chaos that followed, the mark gained something it had never fully possessed before: the ability to survive outside religion entirely. It became a symbolic structure, a psychological template, a portable warning that future generations would apply to everything from political revolutions to industrial technology. The Reformation didn't just reinterpret the mark, it released it. It allowed the mark to slip free from its theological anchor and drift into the broader culture, where it would eventually attach itself to new fears, new systems, and new anxieties that the medieval world could never have predicted. The next chapter of the mark's evolution would unfold, not in monasteries or churches, but in the modern age, an age of machines, nations, ideologies, and identities shaped at scales Revelation's author could not have imagined. But the shadow of the symbol would remain the same. The world that emerged after the Reformation was restless. It accelerated. It expanded. It learned to build machines that reshaped not only landscapes, but the structure of everyday life. And as the Industrial Revolution ignited, first in steam, then in steel, then in electricity, something unexpected happened to the mark of the beast. The symbol survived the Reformation's firestorm of accusations, but as the centuries unfolded, it began to detach itself from purely religious arguments altogether. A new intuition arose, a fear not just of corrupted institutions or theological enemies, but of systems so large, so mechanized, and so inhuman that they could swallow individuality whole. The age of machines changed how people imagined the mark. For the first time in history, human beings watched as work, identity, and survival were reorganized by forces not entirely human. Factories dictated the rhythm of life with mechanical precision. Cities pulsed with new metallic heartbeats. Railways carved through quiet countrysides like iron veins. Governments grew larger, more bureaucratic, more capable of tracking, categorizing, and managing their citizens, and people sensed, sometimes consciously, sometimes only as unease, that this new world was beginning to resemble the architecture of Revelation's warning. The rise of controlled identity. Industrial societies required documentation, registration, identification, birth certificates, work permits, passports, national censuses, official records. Humans were becoming entries in ledgers, numbers in systems, data points in expanding bureaucratic networks. To many, this shift felt like a quiet, subtle mark, not on flesh but on identity, not chosen, but assigned, a sign that participation in society required being counted, cataloged, tracked. For the first time, the mark began to be interpreted as something non-spiritual, something built through human invention rather than prophecy, the fear that systems might replace the human hand with a mechanical one. The machine as beast. Industrialization transformed the metaphor of the beast. No longer a creature of empire or ecclesiastical corruption, it became a symbol of dehumanizing machinery itself, the systems of production, the monotonous requirements of industrial labor, the endless factory lines that reduced people to replaceable parts. Artists of the period often depicted machines as monstrous beasts, iron creatures with gears for teeth and steam for breath. Some writers suggested that industrial society enslaved the mind and hand more effectively than any ancient empire. Workers felt marked not by ink, but by exhaustion, soot, and invisible demands that swallowed their autonomy. Laborers began to speak of factories as devouring jaws. The phrase, "cogs in the machine," became a defining metaphor of the era, a sign that individuality was disappearing into the grind of mass production. Identity, freedom, and the new economy. The industrial age made the link between identity and economic access tighter than ever. To work, you needed papers. To travel, you needed passports. To live in growing cities, you needed to be part of networks, rail lines, postal systems, census lists, tax records. And as these systems expanded, the private individual shrank. People sensed that the world was becoming a kind of grid, a structure, a system that didn't feel fully human. The mark of the beast, once tied to religious allegiance, began to be associated with the fear of being absorbed into a system that no one understood, controlled, or could escape. Electricity and the birth of invisible power. When electricity arrived, and streetlights glowing where darkness once lived, telegraphs linking continents, the world suddenly felt governed by unseen forces. Communication traveled faster than thought. Power flowed through walls. Machines responded to switches. Entire cities lit up at night as if touched by divine fire. Some interpreted the invisible networks of power as a sign that humanity was weaving its own spiritual dangers, creating structures that operated beyond human oversight, invisible energy grids that bound people to new forms of dependence. The idea of an unseen, ubiquitous influence controlling human life began to merge with interpretations of Revelation's beast. The mark became less about a literal sign and more about a condition, a state of being absorbed into invisible infrastructures. Nationalism and mass ideology. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought something else: mass movements, propaganda, and ideologies that demanded absolute allegiance. Nations expected total loyalty. Political leaders were treated with reverence once reserved for kings and gods. Uniforms, badges, flags, and salutes became, in some minds, marks of ideological ownership. When entire populations marched in lockstep, people began to ask, is this what Revelation warned us about? A world where allegiance is demanded so completely that individuality dissolves into collective identity? The fear of the mark evolved yet again, now tied to the power of mass psychology, charismatic leaders, and political machinery capable of reshaping entire cultures. The mark as modern anxiety. By the dawn of the 20th century, the mark of the beast had become something far more fluid than the early church could have imagined. It no longer pointed only to emperors or institutions. It pointed to mechanized labor, expanding bureaucracies, technological control, mass surveillance, nationalistic ideology, systems of documentation, economic dependence on unseen forces. The mark had become modern. It had become the symbol for every fear tied to losing identity in a world too vast to comprehend. And as technological systems grew even more complex, electrified, networked, mechanized, this symbol would not disappear. It would evolve again. Because the next era would magnify all of these anxieties. The age of computers, data, barcodes, scanners, digital records, and invisible networks binding the world together. The industrial age had created the architecture. The digital age would bring the mark closer than anyone expected. By the mid-20th century, the world had entered a chapter unlike any before it. Machines no longer simply moved steel or pumped steam. They were starting to handle information. They could count, sort, record, and identify. And with this shift, subtle at first, then explosive, the mark of the beast began to slide from the realm of theology into the realm of technology. For the first time in human history, identity itself began to take on a digital shape, and people felt that shift immediately. It began with small things: plastic cards, magnetic strips, machines that could read numbers faster than any human clerk, paper currencies giving way to electronic transactions, and then the barcode. A simple arrangement of black lines that suddenly made everything scannable, trackable, sortable. To technologists, barcodes were a triumph of efficiency. To ordinary people, they felt like a quiet revolution in control. To those steeped in Revelation's imagery, they held an eerie resemblance to a mark that connected buying and selling to a hidden system. The world was not forced into this new paradigm. It slipped into it through convenience. Credit cards made purchases easier. Automated systems reduced errors. Barcodes sped up commerce. Computers reduced paperwork. Everything became smoother, faster, quieter. But beneath the surface, people sensed a familiar structure emerging, a world where participation in the economy required a form of identification integrated into every transaction. Industry experts saw efficiency. Artists saw dehumanization. Conspiracy theorists saw prophecy. Individuals felt a quiet, growing unease. The barcode controversy. When barcodes were first introduced in the 1970s, critics noticed something strange. The pattern used to signal the beginning, middle, and end of every barcode resembled the number 6 in the system's encoding scheme. 3 sections, 3 sixes. Coincidence? Design quirk? Or something darker? Most scholars dismiss this as misunderstanding. The sixes weren't literal digits, merely markers for scanning hardware. But symbols don't need to be literal to provoke the imagination. The resemblance triggered a wave of books, sermons, and public debates. People asked whether the barcode was the foundation of a global system predicted in Revelation, a system where every transaction was monitored and controlled by an unseen authority. For the first time in centuries, the mark of the beast surged into mainstream conversation. The credit card revolution. Around the same time, credit cards transformed buying and selling. No longer was money a physical object. It became data, numbers traveling through invisible systems. People worried that financial independence could vanish if digital systems malfunctioned or were controlled by the wrong hands. The magnetic stripe on the back of the card became, for some, a metaphor for the mark, a sign that access to survival now depended on technology rather than personal choice. To those who feared totalizing systems, this felt like a slippery slope. If buying and selling required participation in the digital economy, then opting out meant exclusion. And exclusion, in Revelation's language, was the first step toward the world of the beast. The rise of global networks. Computers grew more advanced. Governments and corporations built centralized databases, international financial systems connected. Identity numbers, social security identifiers, employment codes, all became gateways to essential services. A person's life could now be summarized in a database: name, income, location, purchases, affiliations. A new anxiety emerged. If the world could be organized through numbers, couldn't identity itself become programmable, trackable, controllable? The architecture of modern society began to resemble the prophecy in subtle, unsettling ways, not through tyranny, but through the slow, inevitable expansion of convenience, efficiency, and interconnected systems. The mark had always been about the link between identity and participation. Now, for the first time, that link was being built into the global infrastructure. A new kind of fear. For centuries, the mark of the beast was something distant, a symbol of empire, a sign of corrupt institutions, a theological warning. But the digital age made it immediate, because now, The mark did not have to be a physical brand or tattoo. It could be a digital profile, an identity number, a payment credential, a barcode. The forehead and hand in Revelation symbolized thought and action. In the digital world, those were represented by data. Everything you believed, everything you purchased, everything you did. In this light, the mark became not a literal symbol, but a metaphor for a world where the self could be reduced to a sequence of digits, a world where economic access depended on participating in systems too complex to fully understand. And as technology accelerated, this fear didn't fade. It grew, it morphed, it expanded. Because barcodes and credit cards were just the beginning. Soon, digital identity would move even closer to the body, closer to the rhythms of everyday life, closer to the pulse of who we are. A new era was forming, one where the idea of a mark placed on the body would no longer feel symbolic. It would feel literal. The digital age did not pause to catch its breath. It accelerated with a speed that made history feel compressed, like centuries collapsing into decades. What began with barcodes and credit cards soon evolved into something more intimate, more precise, more deeply connected to the human body itself. For the first time, identity no longer hovered in the space around the person. On plastic cards, in databases, on paper files, it began to migrate inward. The self became mapped, measured, and encoded through biology. And with that shift, the mark of the beast moved closer than it had ever been before. Biometric revolutions. Biometrics began innocently enough. A fingerprint scanner here, a retinal scan there, a voice print for security, a facial recognition system for convenience. At first, these technologies felt like novelty, clever ways to unlock a device or secure a building. But soon, they evolved into something foundational. Governments used biometrics for passports, border control, citizen registration. Corporations used them for unlocking offices and securing data centers. Banks used them for identity verification. Phones learned to recognize faces. Laptops responded to fingerprints. The world became a landscape of invisible gates, each opened by the body itself. Identity was no longer something you carried. It had become something you were, and for many, this shift felt like crossing a threshold. The body as password. In the ancient world, the mark of the beast represented external allegiance. In the industrial world, it represented systems of control. In the digital world, it became a metaphor for the quantification of identity. But biometrics bridged the gap between these worlds. They created a society where a handprint could open a door, a face could authorize a purchase, an iris could replace a signature, a fingerprint could grant access to resources. The right hand and the forehead, imagery once symbolic, suddenly felt literal. Even though most people embraced biometrics for convenience, a quiet fear began to circulate beneath the surface. If identity is fused to the body, what happens when the body is scanned, tracked, or required for participation? This was not paranoia. It was recognition. Biometrics blurred the line between the physical self and the digital system. Microchip experiments. Then came experiments in implantable technology. Tiny RFID chips placed under the skin, usually in the hand, allowed people to open doors, access medical records, store digital keys, or even complete payments. These chips were voluntary, niche, experimental. But they represented something revolutionary, the merging of digital identity with human flesh. For most, these implants were symbols of innovation. For others, they were unsettling, a sign that technology was bypassing external devices entirely, moving directly into the body's architecture. Suddenly, the mark of the beast no longer felt like a poetic warning. It felt like a practical question. What does it mean when access, identity, and survival require a technology embedded in the body? Where is the boundary between convenience and captivity? Facial recognition and the rise of invisible compliance. Facial recognition escalated the speed of integration. Cameras learned to map identities in fractions of a second. Entire populations could be recognized, tracked, categorized without ever touching a device. The human face, once the most personal, intimate element of identity, became a scannable code. Some cities used it for security, some for commerce, some for travel, some for social control. The mark of the beast had always been associated with the ability to buy and sell. Now, in some places, payment systems simply needed a glance. Your face was the currency. Your identity was the key. To many, this felt like progress. To others, it felt like prophecy unfolding through infrastructure rather than miracles. The fear of integration. By the early 21st century, three powerful forces had converged: digital identity, your economic and civic presence in data; biometric verification, your body as the access point; ubiquitous surveillance, your participation constantly observed. This convergence created a new kind of anxiety, the fear that identity had become inseparable from systems of power, not because anyone forced it upon society, but because convenience led everyone there willingly. Where ancient fears focused on rulers, modern fears focused on systems. Where medieval fears focused on institutions, modern fears focused on integration. Where industrial fears focused on mechanization, modern fears focused on data. The mark of the beast was no longer a warning about a sinister branding. It had become a metaphor for the merging of biological identity with technological authority. And as this integration deepened, a new chapter emerged, one where fears were not bound to physical marks, but to digital currencies, centralized databases, algorithmic control, and a future where the boundary between human and system grows ever thinner. In the chapters ahead, the mark will evolve again, not into something on the skin, but into something woven into the digital bloodstream of society. For most of human history, buying and selling required something physical: coins, shells, grain, metals, paper. Money had weight, texture, sound. It clinked in pockets. It rustled in hands. It could be hidden, carried, lost, or stolen. It was tangible, grounding, comforting in its concreteness. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something unprecedented happened. Money began to disappear. Not vanish, but dissolve, shifting from the physical world into the digital realm, where numbers replaced objects and transactions became pulses of light across invisible networks. And as cash dissolved, something ancient resurfaced: the fear that participation in the economy could become controlled, restricted, or revoked by forces beyond the individual. It was the oldest fear in Revelation, resurrected by modern finance. The first step: plastic instead of paper. Credit and debit cards normalized the idea that money could exist as data. People swiped plastic to access invisible balances. Their livelihood flowed through magnetic stripes and chips they couldn't read or understand. It felt seamless, easy, efficient. But it was also centralizing. Bank outages, glitches, fraud freezes, network failures. Any disruption instantly cut people off from their resources, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. This was a new kind of vulnerability, a new kind of dependence, a system where access was granted or denied by algorithms rather than personal possession. For many, it felt like stepping into the world Revelation warned about, not in symbolism, but in structure. Online banking and the invisible vault. As the internet matured, banks migrated online. People managed finances through screens, balances became numbers in clouds, Payments became clicks, entire fortunes condensed into digital representations controlled by servers, encryption, and trust. The convenience was intoxicating. The vulnerability was quiet but profound. For the first time, a person could be financially erased, not by theft, but by system failure. This was not the mark of the beast, but to those who feared absolute dependence, it looked like the scaffolding for it. The cashless movement. Some cities and countries began encouraging or even mandating cashless transactions. Shops stopped accepting coins or bills. Transit systems switched to digital-only payments. Vendors adopted contactless readers. Suddenly, access to basic necessities hinged on devices, accounts, passwords, biometrics, networks, systems. If any of these failed, participation failed. People who lived through this shift felt the pressure of a new reality, a society where survival could hinge on technological compliance. This was not tyranny, it was efficiency. But efficiency can sometimes build structures that prophecy warned about. Mobile payments. Money inside the machine. When phones became wallets, a profound shift occurred. People now carried their financial identity in a device that tracked their location, habits, preferences, and movements. Payment apps linked identity and commerce more tightly than ever. A person's entire economic existence could be locked with one forgotten password, one corrupted update, one malfunctioning device. The body and identity were no longer separated from commerce. They were physically bound to it through the device that lived in one's hand or pocket. The right hand revelation symbol had never been more literal. Digital wallets and the new gatekeepers. Digital payment platforms became intermediaries between individuals and the economy. Tech companies, not banks, not governments, now controlled vast networks of transactions. Accounts could be frozen for security, policy violations, or errors. Entire livelihoods could be interrupted at the push of a button. Access became conditional. Participation required compliance. And compliance required trust in systems that were becoming too large for any one mind to comprehend. A new fear emerged. What happens when economic access is no longer tied to citizenship or identity, but to digital platforms governed by opaque algorithms? For some, this echoed the mark. Not because of prophecy, but because of structure. Cryptocurrencies, the rebellion and the paradox. Then came cryptocurrency, a digital counterculture movement that promised freedom from centralized authority. But even here, the mark's shadow appeared. Crypto required digital identities, digital wallets, verification codes, exchanges, blockchains, mining networks, regulators, algorithms. Some claimed crypto was the mark's foundation, others claimed it was the antidote. Both fears and hopes mirrored Revelation's imagery, showing how deeply the symbol had sunk into modern consciousness. CBDCS, when governments consider their own digital money. The next evolution was the idea of central bank digital currencies. Government-issued digital money with no physical form. These currencies offered streamlined transactions, fraud reduction, and economic efficiency. But they also presented a possibility that had never existed before: the ability to control, monitor, or restrict money at the level of the individual. Such systems could theoretically track every purchase, set spending limits, freeze accounts instantly, deny transactions automatically, require identity verification for every activity. This was not a conspiracy theory. These were literal features discussed in policy papers. For many, the symbolism hit immediately. A world where all buying and selling depended on identity, linked digital currency, echoed Revelation with unnerving clarity. Whether or not such power would be used tyrannically was not the point. The architecture made it possible. And possibility is the spark of fear. The mark reborn through economics. For centuries, the mark of the beast had been tied to politics, religion, ideology, technology. But in the digital age, it returned to its original form, the fear that access to buying and selling could become conditional on allegiance to a system beyond personal control. The mark was never fundamentally a symbol of technology. It was a symbol of dependency, a symbol of identity tied to survival. Cashless economies revived that fear, not because of prophecy, but because they mirrored Revelation's psychology. And the next evolution would take the fear even further. The merging of digital identity, artificial intelligence, global databases, and algorithmic governance. A world where the mark is not placed on the body, but woven into the structure of society itself. Long before the rise of digital surveillance, people had always watched one another. Villages whispered, cities policed, empires documented. But in the 21st century, something transformed. Watching became automated. Tracking became ambient. Systems no longer relied on human eyes or human judgment. They relied on data. Millions of fragments of human life captured, categorized, stored, and interpreted through algorithms that never slept. And for the first time in history, human behavior itself became a kind of currency. This shift, gradual yet seismic, reignited the most ancient fear the mark of the beast had ever represented, that one's ability to participate in society could be tied to conformity, compliance, or allegiance. Not by decree, not by ritual, but by data. The invention of the algorithmic gaze. Modern surveillance is not built on cameras alone. Cameras merely gather. The true engine is interpretation, the software that takes raw pixels and transforms them into identity, behavior, intention, and risk assessment. Artificial intelligence watches patterns, movements, associations, anomalies. The result is a kind of digital omnipresence, a gaze that sees without eyes and judges without a face. Revelation spoke of a beast that monitored who could buy or sell. The modern world built an infrastructure that monitored much more: where people travel, what they purchase, what they say online, who they associate with, what they like, endorse, or criticize, even how they walk, talk, or gesture. Behavior became legible to machines. Identity became a dynamic variable. And from these developments, a new kind of societal pressure emerged. Social scoring, behavior as value. In some societies, experimental systems began assigning values to behavior. Actions aligned with state goals earned privileges. Actions deemed risky reduced access to opportunity. A person's score affected travel, employment, housing, and digital rights. To many outside observers, this looked like a modern echo of Revelation's logic, a world where access to goods and services was conditional on allegiance to the accepted norms. But the truth is even more unsettling. Social scoring systems do not require a single government or institution. They can emerge organically from corporate structures, financial networks, and algorithmic profiling. Insurance companies adjust rates based on behavior. Employers screen candidates using algorithmic predictions. Platforms amplify or suppress voices based on opaque rules. Banks evaluate risk through digital footprints. Digital platforms create hidden reputations through user metrics. The world quietly began to build an invisible scoring system, even where no official one existed. The pressure to behave. In an age of ubiquitous surveillance, people begin to internalize the gaze. They adjust their behavior because they sense they're being watched. They soften opinions. They avoid certain associations. They polish their digital identities. They learn to perform correctness. In doing so, they reveal something Revelation understood thousands of years ago: that the most powerful forms of control are not enforced externally, but absorbed internally. You don't need a brand on the forehead when the mind polices itself. The architecture of dependence. Social scoring systems, formal or informal, thrive on dependence. They work only when participation is necessary, access is conditional, identity is digital, surveillance is constant, behavior is trackable. Non-compliance has consequences. When these ingredients combine, the world begins to resemble the structure Revelation warned about, not because prophecy is unfolding, but because human societies drift naturally toward systems that reward conformity and discourage dissent. This is the modern version of the ancient fear that power can shape behavior through invisible incentives rather than physical force. The digital forehead and the digital hand. In Revelation, the forehead symbolizes identity. The hand symbolizes action. In modern systems, the forehead becomes your digital profile, the sum of your data, preferences, history, and behavior. And the hand becomes your digital activity, what you click, purchase, watch, endorse, or engage with. The mark in this context is not a symbol etched on flesh. It is a pattern etched in data, a digital identity that governs your access to society, a behavioral record that determines your privileges, an invisible reputation that follows you everywhere, whether you consent or not. A new form of allegiance. Surveillance systems do not demand worship, they demand compliance, and compliance becomes a kind of allegiance, not emotional or spiritual, but behavioral. People begin to act not according to conscience, but according to the expectations of the system. This is the modern equivalent of the mark, the quiet reconfiguration of the human person under the weight of algorithmic expectations. Not a brand, not a chip, not a barcode, but a profile. A profile that decides your standing in the digital ecosystem. A profile that determines how the world treats you. A profile that can be erased, restricted, silenced, or flagged with no warning. The mark as metadata. The mark of the beast, once tied to ink, flesh, or rituals, now reappears as metadata, the invisible layer of identity that determines access, permission, visibility, and trust. This interpretation is not theological. It is structural. It reflects a world where behavior is tracked, identity is quantified, access is conditional, systems are opaque, participation is required. In such a world, the boundary between freedom and conformity becomes thin, so thin that people may not notice when they step across it. Revelation warned about a mark that controlled who could buy and sell. The modern world built systems that can control far more, not through tyranny, but through data. And the fears that follow are not apocalyptic fantasies. They are natural responses to a world where technology influences identity, behavior, and opportunity in ways no human society has ever experienced before. The mark has moved from skin to system, and in the next segment it will move once more into the realm of global connectivity, AI governance, and the merging of human decision-making with machine control. There is a quiet moment in every technological revolution when the machinery stops feeling like a tool and begins to feel like a world. That moment arrived when artificial intelligence stepped out of research laboratories and began weaving itself into the infrastructure of global society, not as a single, monolithic entity, but as a constellation of algorithms governing everything from transportation to finance to communication to identity. AI didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived like gravity, subtle, constant, inescapable. Suddenly, decisions once made by humans were being filtered, shaped, or entirely controlled by systems no single person truly understood. And with that shift came a new kind of fear. Not of machines acting alone, but of machines amplifying the power of central institutions so efficiently that human oversight became symbolic. This is where the mark of the beast drifted once again, into the realm of global systems shaped by AI, converging into something vast, seamless, and eerily familiar. The dream of centralization. Modern societies crave efficiency. They crave synchronization. They crave systems that eliminate friction, error, and delay. AI became the perfect solution, capable of coordinating resources, optimizing traffic, predicting risk, and analyzing billions of data points instantly. Governments imagined centralized platforms for identity verification, digital payments, healthcare records, border control, public safety, and social services, all unified under a single AI-driven system. Corporations imagined global networks for purchases, advertising, behavioral prediction, financial management, and personalized services, all driven by machine learning. The world began to converge. That convergence created something new. A global architecture where identity, finance, communication, and behavior were no longer separate domains, but interconnected elements in a single algorithmic ecosystem. The rise of algorithmic authority. For centuries, authority was embodied in rulers, kings, emperors, popes, governments. But AI introduced a form of authority with no face, no voice, no personality. A system that simply was, operating silently in the background. AI determined what news people saw, what advertisements followed them, what loans they qualified for, what risks they posed, what jobs they were suited for, what behaviors triggered alerts. Authority migrated from individuals to systems, from judgment to calculation, from interpretation to probability. This was not tyranny. It was optimization. Yet it created a structure eerily reminiscent of Revelation's warnings, a world where access to participation passed through an invisible gatekeeper. The fear of a unified system. The most unsettling possibility wasn't that AI would become malevolent. It was that it would become indispensable. Imagine a world where every transaction is algorithmically authenticated, every identity is algorithmically verified, every movement is algorithmically tracked, every communication is algorithmically filtered, every opportunity is algorithmically scored. No single government would need to enforce the mark. It would emerge naturally from the convergence of systems too large to resist. The mark of the beast, in this interpretation, becomes the default condition of technological civilization, the inevitable result of integrating identity, economy, and behavior into a global digital infrastructure governed by AI. Not forced, not imposed, but emergent. The AI-governed marketplace. In such a world, accessing the marketplace, whether digital or physical, requires verified identity, verified devices, verified compliance with platform rules, verified account standing, verified location, verified patterns of behavior. The forehead becomes the digital self, the profile shaped by actions, preferences, and algorithmic judgments. The hand becomes the activity, the transactions, clicks, movements, purchases. AI becomes the interpreter of both. This is why, for many, AI systems feel like the infrastructure of Revelation's economy, not because of prophecy, but because of structure. The loss of the untracked life. For most of human history, it was possible to exist beyond systems, to barter, to trade privately and to move anonymously, to hold physical money, to live unrecorded, to belong without documentation. AI-driven systems threaten the last remaining pockets of untracked existence. They create a world where every action feeds the network, where every footprint becomes data, where every identity must be verified to be recognized. And when recognition becomes conditional, belonging becomes conditional. This is the fear at the root of every modern interpretation of the mark, that participation in the world may one day require submission to a unified, global, algorithmic system. The global drift. No single institution needs to plan such a system. The world drifts toward it through efficiency, standardization, digital synchronization, interoperability, global finance, AI governance, risk management, convenience. Billions of invisible decisions push society toward a single, interconnected framework, not because of prophecy, but because of momentum. The mark of the beast becomes a metaphor for a world where identity is inseparable from system, where access is inseparable from compliance, where the human being is inseparable from the digital architecture that surrounds it. And the next stage of this evolution is even more profound, a world where not just identity and behavior, but truth itself becomes shaped by AI. But before we reach that final transformation, the mark must pass through one more doorway. The merging of global governance, AI prediction models, international crisis management, and algorithmic coordination. A world where the beast is not a creature or a ruler, but a system so encompassing that no one can live outside it. Every symbol that survives history survives for a reason. Some fade when the world that created them disappears. Some die when the fears behind them dissolve. Some linger only in dusty manuscripts or forgotten rituals. But the mark of the beast is different. It refuses to fade. It refuses to die. It reappears again and again, reshaped, reinterpreted, reattached to every new invention that unsettles the human imagination. It is one of the very few symbols in history that evolves with civilization itself. Why? Because the mark is not truly about the beast. It is about us, about the structure of human societies, the nature of power, and the fragile line between participation and surrender. The mark as an archetype. The mark of the beast is not a prediction. It is an archetype, a timeless pattern that reemerges whenever people feel that identity is being shaped by forces beyond their control. Participation in the economy requires a form of surrender. Institutions demand allegiance that feels intrusive. Technology integrates too deeply into daily life. Systems grow too large to understand. Freedom feels conditional rather than inherent. These anxieties are not tied to any one era. They exist in every civilization that reaches a certain level of complexity. Ancient Rome had them. Medieval Europe had them. The Reformation had them. The Industrial Revolution had them. The digital age has them even more. The mark of the beast endures because it describes a universal human tension. The fear of losing the self to something larger, more powerful, and more demanding than any individual can resist. The mark as a psychological mirror. In psychology, symbols that persist are often mirrors, reflections of our deepest internal states. The mark represents the fear of being controlled, the fear of being absorbed, the fear of being tracked, the fear of being defined, the fear of being replaced, the fear of being owned, the fear of losing autonomy. These fears surface whenever societies reorganize themselves around new forms of power. When religion dominated life, the mark was seen in religious institutions. When kings dominated life, it was seen in political structures. When machines dominated life, it was seen in industry. When corporations dominated life, it was seen in technology. When data dominated life, it was seen in digital identity. Wherever power accumulates, the mark appears, not as prophecy, but as metaphor. The mark as a warning against overreach. Symbols survive when they carry wisdom worth preserving. The mark of the beast warns about something profoundly human, that power becomes dangerous when it merges identity and survival. Whenever access to society, to food, work, housing, medicine, travel, communication, becomes tied to allegiance to a system, people instinctively feel the shadow of the mark. This is why the mark reappears in social scoring, biometric ID global surveillance, digital wallets, centralized databases, ideological conformity, authoritarian governments, corporate monopolies, AI-mediated societies. It reappears because each of these touches the ancient nerve at the heart of Revelation's imagery, a world where belonging requires surrender. The mark as a cultural immune system. Another way to see the mark is as a cultural warning mechanism, a story that helps societies remain vigilant. When the mark reemerges in public debate, it often signals that people feel systems becoming too powerful, too opaque, too interconnected. The symbol forces questions that no civilization can afford to ignore. How much conformity should society demand? How much power should institutions hold over identity? Should participation in the economy ever require specific beliefs or behaviors? How deeply should technology be allowed to merge with the body? How should data about individuals be controlled, stored, or protected? These questions are not religious. They are foundational to the structure of freedom. The mark endures because it alerts us when the balance tilts too far. The mark as a story about limits. Every myth that survives teaches something about boundaries, the limits of human ambition, the limits of power, the limits of technology. The mark warns that power should not be absolute. Allegiance should not be coerced. Identity should not be programmable. Access should not be conditional on conformity. Systems should not overshadow the human person. These lessons are timeless, and so the symbol that conveys them becomes timeless too. The mark as a narrative of resistance. Perhaps the most overlooked reason the mark survives is that it contains a built-in story of resistance. For every warning about allegiance, Revelation contains a vision of people who refuse it, people who choose autonomy over survival. This story has inspired generations of thinkers, rebels, philosophers, and artists. It has shaped resistance movements, civil rights campaigns, and critiques of technology and governance. It reminds people that to refuse coercive power is to reclaim the self. To choose conscience over conformity is to remain human. To resist the mark is to live without surrender. A symbol for every era. Because the mark can adapt to any form of power, it becomes relevant again whenever the world changes. In industrialization, the fear of mechanized conformity. In surveillance, the fear of constant visibility. In digital identity, the fear of algorithmic judgment. In global networks, the fear of universal dependence. In biometrics, the fear of the body becoming a password. In AI governance, the fear of humanity becoming data. The mark is not a static prophecy. It is a living idea, a shape-shifting warning encoded in human culture, an alarm bell that rings whenever society edges too close to a system where identity, behavior, and survival are bound together in ways that threaten freedom. It is the fear that the world might one day become so unified, so efficient, so optimized, that individuality becomes optional. And it is this fear, more than any ancient text, that ensures the mark will appear again in the future. There is a moment at the end of every long journey when the story returns not to the world, but to the self. After 15 segments, after tracing the mark of the beast across continents, centuries, empires, religions, technologies, revolutions, and digital systems, it becomes clear that the mark is not just a symbol embedded in prophecy. It is a mirror held up to the human experience. It is a myth that asks a deeply personal question. In a world full of systems, structures, and powers that demand something from you, what part of yourself are you willing to surrender? This question is why the mark endures. This question is why it resurfaces in every era. This question is why the symbol refuses to die. Revelation framed that question using imagery of beasts and marks, of faithful resistance and systemic dominance. Modern society frames it through data, algorithms, identity, economics, and connectivity. But the underlying tension remains the same: human autonomy standing against forces that seek to shape, claim, or absorb it. Beyond prophecy, the mark is a human pattern. At its core, the mark of the beast speaks to a recurring human fear that we might lose ourselves in a world that moves too fast, grows too large, and demands too much. It reflects the universal anxiety that identity can be overshadowed, overwritten, or controlled by systems we did not choose. But it also reflects something more subtle and more profound: the fear that we may willingly choose comfort over freedom, that we may drift into conformity without realizing it, that we may trade autonomy for convenience. This is the real mark, not on the body, but on the choices we make. The mark as a symbol of dependency. Every era has its own version of dependency. Rome demanded political allegiance. Medieval Europe demanded religious allegiance. Industrial society demanded economic conformity. The digital world demands identity integration. AI-driven systems demand behavioral legibility. Whenever access to society becomes conditional, whenever survival depends on conformity to a system's demands, the specter of the mark re-emerges. It is not tied to technology. It is not tied to religion. It is not tied to prophecy. It is tied to the human experience of power. Power is the true beast. In every age, the beast is not a creature. It is a structure. It is the accumulation of power beyond accountability. It is the merging of identity with compliance. It is the institutionalization of control. It is the system that asks, who are you willing to become in order to belong? The beast is any power that demands your selfhood in exchange for participation. The mark is the sign of that exchange. Where the mark exists today. If you look for the literal mark, a tattoo, a chip, a brand, you miss the point. The modern mark is subtle. It is in systems that track more than they reveal. It is in platforms that reward conformity and punish dissent. It is in economies where identity is a prerequisite for survival. It is in algorithms that redefine who you are. It is in technologies that merge with the body, not by force, but by dependence. It is in social structures that normalize constant surveillance. It is in global infrastructures that make opting out nearly impossible. Today, the mark is not placed on the skin. It is placed in the relationship between self and system. The mark as a choice. Revelation's brilliance is that it doesn't describe the mark as something that appears suddenly or surprisingly. It describes it as something people accept, something tied to participation, convenience, survival. The ancient world demanded loyalty. The modern world demands visibility. The future may demand integration. The mark, then, becomes the symbol of the moment when a person stops choosing, stops questioning, stops resisting, and begins to accept systems without asking what they cost. The mark is not about technology. It is about the erosion of self-awareness. The countermark, the refusal. But Revelation also describes a counter-symbol, the people who refuse the mark. They are not identified by heroism or power. They are identified by something quieter and more human, the refusal to surrender identity, the refusal to let systems define them, the refusal to mistake convenience for freedom, the refusal to allow survival to become their only value. The countermark is the choice to remain conscious, autonomous, and intentional in a world that rewards effortless conformity. This is what the mark truly means today, a reminder that autonomy is not a guarantee, it is a discipline, A reminder that freedom is not an inheritance. It is a practice. A reminder that identity is not static. It must be protected. The eternal lesson. The mark endures because it carries the oldest lesson in human civilization, that systems are powerful, but individuals still have agency. That power expands, but conscience can resist. That technology grows, but autonomy can adapt. That the future is uncertain, but the self has boundaries worth defending. The mark of the beast is not a prediction of doom. It is a caution about surrender, a warning about unchecked systems, a myth that teaches vigilance in every era, especially in ours. What it means for us today. In the end, the mark asks one simple question: what will you allow to write itself on your identity? The world or your own conscience? If the mark remains relevant, it is because this question has no expiration date, because every society must ask it, because every individual must answer it, because autonomy, once lost, does not return easily. The mark of the beast is not a prophecy about technology or currency or microchips. It is a story about power, choice, and the fragile, luminous thread of human freedom. A thread that must be protected. Forehead and hand, thought and action, identity and participation. For as long as humanity continues to build systems larger than itself, this is what the mark truly means. Not fear, not doom, not inevitability, but awareness. A myth that survives so we do not forget ourselves.